The miraculous crucifix that moves, looks at each faithful, and cries blood. We can all count several supernatural manifestations that happened in our lives, but the question always remains for others, could it have been like that? Are you not exaggerating, carried out by your faith? But there are cases in which the demonstrations have been seen by thousands of people, including atheists, and are linked to other phenomena such as miraculous healings. Then the doubts tend to fade away. Here we will tell the story of a crucifix that had impressive supernatural manifestations, which were seen by thousands of people, and through which thousands of cures were produced. And that later has had replicas and images of it, whose tears have been studied and contain human heart tissue, as in Eucharistic miracles. How would you react if a crucifix in a church in front of you begins to shed tears, or you see drops of blood fall from his temples pierced by the crown of thorns? And if you see that the Christ looks at you, and not only at you, but that he rests his gaze on each one of those present? This happened, and much more. Some said that the Christ on the cross looked at them with kindness, others with gravity, and still others with a penetrating and severe look. They saw how he moved his eyes from one side to the other, and his gaze passed over all those who were in the temple. His thorn-crowned head moved from side to side. Sometimes it seemed that a deep sigh came from his chest, and sometimes he seemed to whisper. Other times his shoulders would begin to move, twist and bend, like a man does when nailed alive to a cross. Everything was in motion, only the hands and feet were firmly fixed. And in the end, the whole body would relax as if it were exhausted, and it would return to its natural position with its head and eyes turned towards the sky. When these demonstrations took place, most of those present knelt deeply moved, asked for forgiveness, thanked him, cried, and some even fainted. This happened for years with the life-size crucifix, which presides over the altar of the Church of San Pedro in the city of Limpias in Santander, Spain. There are more than 8,000 written testimonies about what happened, 2,500 given under oath. And among the witnesses were members of religious orders, priests, university professionals, scientists, doctors, merchants, manual workers, housewives, believers and non-believers, and even atheists. And how did all this start? Around 1700 a tsunami threatened the city of Cadiz, and the Christian people took the most revered images in the city in procession. But the water stopped and began to recede only before the image of the Christ of agony. In view of the prodigy, the grateful people asked that the image of the Holy Christ be placed in veneration in one of the churches of Cadiz. It came to be venerated in the Church of the Franciscan Fathers, and when the temple collapsed due to floods, the image passed to the private oratory of Don Diego de la Piedra, a knight of the Order of Santiago. In 1755 Don Diego de la Piedra died. And in his will he asks to install the sculptural ensemble of Christ, the Virgin Mary and Saint John in the parish of his native town, Limpias, and pays for the restoration of the temple and a new high altar. Thus the old Church of San Pedro will become the sanctuary of the Holy Christ of the Agony of Limpias. Limpias is a city in Cantabria, on the route of the Camino to Santiago, about 80 kilometers from Garabandal, where the famous apparitions of Our Lady took place in the 1960s. The name of Limpias comes from the hot springs that gushed there. The manifestations of the crucifix in Limpias began privately in 1914 and began to be public in 1919, taking place for several years, and acquiring such worldwide relevance that in 1921 the pilgrimages to Limpias exceeded those to Lourdes and Rome. Limpias's image of the crucifix depicts Christ in the last moments of his life, with a half-painful, half-relaxed expression, looking up with open eyes. His hands are making a blessing gesture, and he is wearing a crown of thorns on his head. It is estimated that it is the work of the sculptor Pedro de Mina and stands out for its realism, especially the eyes. It is 1.80 centimeters high and is on a cross that is 2.30 centimeters high. And on both sides are the Virgin of Sorrows and Saint John the Evangelist. The first demonstration was received by Father Antonio Lopez in August 1914 when he was installing electric lighting on the main altar. Climbing on a ladder, he began to clean the image, and when he looked into his eyes, no more than 50 cms from the face, he saw that he had them closed, when it is a sculpture that stands out for its wide open eyes. He fell from the ladder to the ground in shock and lost consciousness. And when he related what happened to the sacristan, he was not surprised, because he had already heard that the Holy Christ had closed his eyes on more than one occasion. He reported this to his superior from the Fathers, who asked him to document it, but to keep it secret. This document only came to light in 1920, a year after the massive public demonstrations began. The first massive public demonstration happened on March 30th, 1919, in the middle of Lent. The priest was celebrating Mass and two other priests confessing in the confessionals. And a 12-year-old girl informed a confessing priest that the Holy Christ had his eyes closed. The faithful began to riot with enthusiasm, crying, shouting and praying on their knees, when the Holy Christ is seen moving his eyes and even sweating drops of blood. The priests evacuate the church, and one goes up to the dressing room of the image, touches it, and his fingers inexplicably get wet. 2 days later, the archpriest of Limpias sends a letter to the Bishop of Santander telling what happened. The second public demonstration took place on Palm Sunday, April 13, 1919, when two prominent men from Limpias, one a merchant and the other an intellectual, wanted to verify the rumors that had spread. They approached the image and saw that the Christ's eyes and mouth moved, and they fell on their knees asking for forgiveness. The third demonstration took place on Easter Sunday, April 20th, 1919. A group of nuns were praying the rosary and saw that the eyes and mouth of the Holy Christ were moving. And from there the demonstrations began to become almost daily. A few years later the phenomena stopped, but the pilgrimages continue to this day. In July 1920 alone, doctors certified more than 1,000 cures, some in Limpias, others back home, and others when the sick came into contact with objects that had touched the Holy Christ of Limpias. The most famous case was that of a priest who had fallen asleep praying with a picture of Cristo de Limpias in his hand. And when he woke up he saw that he was completely cured of hemiplegia, something declared inexplicable by the doctors. Given these facts, the Bishop of Santander gave a plenary indulgence for a period of 7 years to all those faithful who visited the Holy Christ of Limpias. The Apostolic Nuncio visited Limpias in September 1921 and drew up an act for the Holy See, opening a canonical file that would be in charge of investigating the facts. But as usual, these investigations ended in the conclusion that there is no humanly reasonable explanation for what happened. From these demonstrations, the Christ of the Agony of Limpias is also venerated in other countries, and its images produced demonstrations. The Bishop of Cuba Manuel Ruiz y Rodriguez was the first bishop to witness the demonstrations. And when he returned to the island, the devotion to the Christ of Limpias began in Cuba, a sanctuary to the Christ of Limpias was built in Havana, and the Crusade of Christ of Limpias was founded, which proclaimed the recitation of the Rosary daily. And in 1990, a Bolivian lady named Silvia Arevalo, who was a flight attendant, bought a plaster image of the Christ of Limpias from Lima to venerate at her home in Bolivia. The image is only the bust of the Christ of the Agony of Limpias with the crown of thorns, approximately 30 centimeters. The next day she discovered that there were drops of water on his face, and the phenomenon was reported by family members, friends, and also by the press, revealing what had happened to all of Cochabamba. And then he began to shed tears of blood. This happened on several occasions up to our time. Dr. Ricardo Castañón was called to investigate the phenomenon, and his studies confirmed that the reddish liquid, analyzed in laboratories, is human blood, without precise DNA, and contains cardiac tissue. A commission of 4 priests appointed by the bishop in 1995 determined that it is an inexplicable phenomenon due to natural causes, where God calls for the conversion of the heart. In 1997, a report was sent to Rome and the bishop issued a decree authorizing the veneration of the image. So far, what we wanted to tell about the manifestations of the Christ of Limpias, which was one of the most impressive supernatural events of the 20th century, and its subsequent ramifications. And I would like to ask you what you would do if you went to a temple and saw that the Christ on the crucifix that is in the church moves, looks at you and cries tears of blood?